I'm Cheryl Chumley. This is Bold and Blunt, giving you a Christian conservative view of news, politics, culture, and events. Avi Melamed, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt video. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So you are in Israel right now. You said outside Tel Aviv or in Tel Aviv. And your brief background, as I have it, you are a former Israeli intelligence official and the author of Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era. And I wanted to talk with you about what's taking place, breaking news coming out of Israel about Rafah, the seeming attack. The latest is the defense official has told Palestinians in Gaza to clear Rafah. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on?
Yes, well, as you probably know, as part of the whole situation in Gaza Strip, remains of Hamas battalions are, roughly speaking, located in Gaza Strip. There are about some 4 battalions remain out of 24. As you probably know, many of Gaza people flee to the area of Rafah, which is located on the south part of Gaza. It's right on the borderline between Gaza and Egypt. As there has been negotiations going on between Hamas and Israel, this whole plan of Israel to militarily deal with the remaining battalions of Hamas was put on a hold as long as the negotiations were going. Seemingly, the negotiations reached a dead end. And didn't bear any fruitful fruits. And parallel to that, there has been yesterday an attack launched by Hamas from Rafah, charging the life of 3 Israeli soldiers and others. And so it seems like it's basically boosted Israeli war of cabinet and government decision to move on as planned and to deal with the challenge of Rafah.
So insofar as the world's criticism of Israel in terms of entering Rafah, can you talk a little bit about the Jewish people? Are they concerned about what the world's governments are saying and warning against an attack on Rafah, or are they standing alongside Benjamin Netanyahu in his insistence that Rafah must be cleared of Hamas?
I would say overwhelmingly there are 2 major consensus within Israeli public opinion. I'm talking about the Jewish part, of course. And this is a community that has a lot of inner divisiveness about many things, but there are 2 major consensus within Israeli Jews. One is that Israel needs to move forward and to release the hostages in every way possible. And second, Israel has to end the threat that Hamas presents to Israel. And the second thing is that there is a very little hope within Israeli Jews that the world governments of the world will really stand up next to Israel. We see right now what's going on in many capitals in the West. We see the whole issue of international court that are basically putting Israel on the bench of defenders. So in that regards, there is a very little hope or trust of Israeli Jews in any kind of like these international organizations and agencies.
Does Israel still see under this Joe Biden administration America as an ally?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes. It was really clearly proven during this war. There are some segments within Israeli public opinion, but they are on the fringes that basically has some criticism on Biden administration. But all in all, I think that overwhelmingly majority of the Israelis understand how significant the United States is for Israel's strategic security.
Let's talk about the deal that was on the table and how negative it was for Israel. Give the specifics of the latest ceasefire deal that Hamas and Israel were supposed to be discussing.
Well, there has been different pieces of information coming in. I don't know to say decisively what was the exact articles of that deal, but roughly speaking, the idea is to have a multi-phase deal where during each phase, Hamas will release more and more hostages. I think that the first part of this deal was supposed to focus on women, elderly and little kids that are in the hands of Hamas or others in Gaza Strip who were involved in October 7 attack on Israel. And there has been different numbers regarding the potential Palestinian prisoners that will be swapped in such a deal. I don't know to say the exact number. So roughly speaking, it was supposed to be a multi-phase deal, specifically talking about periods of weeks between each phase and phase. During those weeks, there was supposed to be some sort of like ceasefire. Hamas demand Israel to totally withdraw from Gaza Strip and end the war. Israeli government says it's not acceptable. We are not going to withdraw from Gaza Strip. We are not going to end the war as long as Hamas continue to hold Israeli hostages.
Do we know how many exactly hostages there are at this time and how many are still alive? Is there evidence? Is there proof of whether they are alive?
To the best of my knowledge, right now there are 132 Israeli hostages. We have clear indication that at least 33 of them are not alive. It is very possible that the number of hostages dead is higher than the number that I just mentioned. There is a major concern within Israeli intelligence agencies that the number is really higher than that.
And I understand by reading just quickly through some headlines and stories this morning that the attack on Rafah will impact, according to CNN, is one source I can cite, about 100,000 Palestinian civilians. But I understand the IDF is dropping flyers and doing everything it can to try and evacuate those civilians. Talk a little bit about the difficulty IDF faces while waging an attack on Hamas, but still trying to maintain safety and passages for fleeing for the civilians.
Well, Rafah is a quintessential of the whole challenge that Israel has been battling against Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, namely through two major perspectives. One is the fact that it is a massively urban area, and the other fact is that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are using their own brothers and sisters as human shields. They are operating from their own civil society, of course, trying to, as crazy as it may sound, they hope is that the more number of Palestinians will get killed, it plays to their hand because they know that it will put pressure on the international community to put pressure on Israel to stop the war. So in that regard, Rafah is kind of like a quintessential of this whole large picture of the battle, which is very complex battle in Gaza Strip. As the battle moved on since October 7, or to be more accurate, since the end of October when Israel invaded Gaza Strip, many Palestinians, citizens and non-citizens, flee down to the area of Rafah. So right now, actually, you got a situation where Rafah became, as I said before, the last resort, sort of speaking, of some estimated 4 battalions of Hamas, and also a resort for estimated some 1 million Palestinians that flee to this area. So one of the major challenges, actually, of course, actually, is to, if Israel is conduct the fight, Israel has to do an enormous effort to try and to minimize as much as possible collateral damage, and meaning an essential part of this whole battle plan in Rafah must take care of the well-being of the civilians, of the people that are not involved in the fight. And so this is one aspect. The other aspect is the need to sift, sort of speaking, between Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants and civilians. The reason for that is because the Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants are basically disguised as civilians. So there is also a need to do this sift while you are basically clearing this whole area from civil presence and basically moving civilians to a safe area, relatively speaking. So all in all, you can have here, you can understand how challenging this whole situation right there in Rafah.
Just a couple other questions and then we have to wrap, but talk about after. Say Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF are successful with eradicating Hamas, which has been the mission, as I understand it, from the beginning. What happens after when the Palestinian civilians go to implement a new government? What's to say that they wouldn't vote for another terror group such as Hamas? How would Israel deal in the coming years with that reality?
Well, Cheryl, first I must say Hamas is not going to be eliminated. It has to be clear. The whole idea in the end of the day is not to eliminate Hamas because it's irrelevant, it's not realistic. The whole idea in the end of the day is to create a situation where Hamas and Islamic Jihad, two major Palestinian militant groups that are leading a very, very genocidal agenda, will not be able in the end of the day to continue and to dictate their radical agenda on both Israelis and Palestinians, and also by doing that, they are serving the interest of the mullah regime in Tehran. So this is one thing that has to be clear. The other thing that you have very accurately mentioned is the whole issue of the inner Palestinian discussion. And in the end of the day, the message that comes from the Arab world to the Palestinian is you need to make up your mind. You need to decide whether you want to continue and stick on Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Iranian way, and then you have to bear the consequences, or you have to decide whether you want to take another path. I think that message is enormously significant to internalize because it has not been present in the discussion in the West. I think this is something very significant to bring to the attention of the Western media and the Western public in discussion.
And that's sort of what it comes down to, right? Just last question here, because the media that used to be right after October 7th on the side of the Israeli citizens, painting the Israelis as the victim, have now turned and 180-degreed it and put Israel as sort of the aggressors here. So how do you paint a proper, truthful context and narrative in the media and to the West that sees Israel and sees the terrorists not as moral equivalents, but basically Israel as the victims here?
Well, Cheryl, you are doing it by hard work of education, a process that unfortunately has very much neglected in the Western discussion for the last generation. Real education includes pursuit of information, analyzing information, critical thinking, contextualizing information, understanding nuanced aspect of information. All of these building blocks have been totally pushed aside in the age of what I call the narrative-based emotional discussion, which has a disastrous outcome, not only in terms of ignorance and lack of knowledge and lack of understanding and lack of ability to come with a relevant policy, but not less significant in the context of dismantling moral codex. These are significant ramifications of the process of the sacrificing of real education at the altar of a narrative, emotional narrative-based discussion.
Avi Melamed, I want to thank you so much for coming on Bold and Blunt Video. Stay safe in Israel, and I hope to have you back.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Shelly. Shalom from Israel.